Crosscultural, Interpictorial, and Transgender, the Convergence of Male Icons in the Gandharan Visual Field, Implications for Art History. My paper addresses the cultural exchange and artistic interaction between European and Western Asian civilizations in Gandhara from approximately the 1st century BC to the 6th century AD, and attempts to bring approaches to the study of Gandharan art into context with contemporary discussions on global art history. Current theoretical debates on global art history are premised on the critique of the narrow scope of contents and methods of a heretofore predominantly Western-oriented history and canon of art, which have neglected not only the arts of non-Western cultures, but also the connections and interactive relationships between Western, Eastern, Northern, and Southern hemispheres. If the global is to become a primary cognitive category in the study of art history, it will not be sufficient to expand the disciplinary framework through the deconstruction of a Eurocentric perspective and concept of art. Rather, art history scope and parameters would need to be further differentiated so as to also account for earlier movements of global entanglement. This is not only because early periods have traditionally been neglected in global approaches, but also because current studies tend to see contemporary changes as novel and unique without having established a degree or quality of this novelty. As recent scholarship has pointed out, ethnic diversity and cultural transfer are not exclusively modern or postmodern phenomena, but are characteristic of complex early societies where warfare, trade relations, and migratory movements have led to transcultural encounter and exchange. Thus, in order to account not only for non-Western, but also for non-contemporary and non-traditional art forms, my paper proposes the consideration of the exchange between different cultural hemispheres in the greater Gandhara region as a case study of early global transfer in art making. I will begin by giving a historical survey of the greater Gandhara region. I will then apply the concepts of transculturality and interpictoriality, as well as the concept of gender, in a transcultural context, namely in reference to existing research on Gandhara, with the goal of reconsidering the study of Gandhara in a global art historical context. Gandhara is the ancient name of the borderland between present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, covering specifically the area between the southern slopes of the Hindu Kush and the region around Peshawar. At the height of its power and prosperity, it reached from the region surrounding Bactria north of the Hindu Kush all the way to central North India. By the early centuries BC, the region already formed an important crossroad within the system of the Eurasian Silk Roads, where, as a region, it mediated between India and East Asia, while also being exposed to goods from Persia and the Eastern Mediterranean. A systematic study of any aspect of Gandhara's history is extremely difficult due to the region's experience with military intrusion over many centuries, as well as its population's highly diverse cultural, religious, and ethnic blend. As of approximately the 6th century BC, the area was occupied by foreign empires and nomadic tribes who successively moved through the region from the east, west, and north. In 330 BC, Alexander the Great began his massive invasion of the periphery of the Persian Empire, crossing Bactria and reaching the Indus Delta in 326 and 325 BC. This so-called Helleno-Bactrian Empire, which was further expanded by Alexander's successors, lasted approximately 100 years, from 250 BC to 150 BC. In the 2nd century BC, and this is an alternative view of the region, in the 2nd century BC, a number of nomadic peoples originating from southern Siberia, China, Scythia, or Indo-Scythia moved from the eastern part of Central Asia to the more central regions and, in the 1st century BC, into the region of Gandhara. Another nomadic people that played a major role in the development of Gandhara were the tribe of the Kushana, who, coming from East Asia, had passed through the Pamir Basin and subsequently settled in Bactria in the 1st century BC. This means that shortly before and after the turn of the millennium, different peoples and tribes had assimilated themselves to their Indian host territories in the greater Gandhara region. The historically unique fusion of European and Asian cultures brought forth a multicultural civilization that became a major center of religious exchange, trade, and learning, as well as a cultural interface between India, Central Asia, and the Middle East. After the Greeks, the Parthians, as well as the Shakas and Scythians had lost their political control of Gandhara from approximately the 1st century to the 5th century AD, the region brought forth what is now known as Gandharan art. Gandharan art was almost exclusively religious, standing in the service of the Buddhist belief system. A large number of the former Buddhist sites is still visible in the mountainous borderland between present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, serving as an indication of an immense system of cultural and artistic production. The creation of the first anthropomorphic image of the Buddha constituted an important reformation of Buddhist religion and art. Whether the first Buddha statue came into being in Gandhara or in Mathura, a city further to the southwest, is an academic controversy which remains unsolvable to this day. What has been established, however, is that between the 1st century AD and the 2nd century AD, the Buddha was represented in a seated, lying, and standing position in images made in both artistic centers of the Kushan Empire. In the 5th century AD, the seat of the Kushan rulers, as well as numerous Buddhist monasteries, were destroyed by the Hephthalites, or White Huns, who were advancing towards India. When Muslim tribes crossed through Gandhara at the beginning of the 2nd millennium, they destroyed all of the remaining Buddhist monasteries and religious sites, including their art. Since then, Gandhara, as well as Bactria and the regions of present-day Afghanistan, belong to the Islamic world. Gandhara was rediscovered in the second half of the 19th century when the remains of its religious sites, as well as large quantities of statues and reliefs, were found near Peshawar, as well as in the Swat Valley and the regions around ancient Takshashila. Soldiers and employees of the British colonial movement, as well as local treasure hunters, took possession of the antiquities, after which they were screened and examined by scholars from Europe. These scholars found the objects to bear resemblance with Hellenistic models, which led to their being labeled as Greek, Roman, or Greco-Roman Buddhist art. Although in the 20th century several theories were advanced with which to identify and date the artifacts, not enough empirical evidence has been secured to establish a definite chronology of Gandharan art. In addition, because of their many differences in style and craftsmanship, the objects do not allow general conclusions to be drawn as to their iconography and provenance. For this reason, the study of numismatic evidence assumed a central role, since the design and minting of the coins offered extensive chronological as well as iconographic information. The ancient Buddhist culture of Gandhara became once again the focus of international attention when two colossal Buddha statues at Bamiyan were destroyed by the Taliban in 2001. Since then, an international team of researchers has been able to examine and measure the remnants of these statues, as well as to virtually reconstruct them by way of 3D computer technology, with the goal of rebuilding at least one of the statues in the future. Transculturality. Essentialized concepts of culture have led to a global configuration where cultures are demarcated and separated, and where Orient and Occident have been perceived as mutually exclusive cultural, geographical, and temporal entities, and not in terms of their relative geographical proximity and transitional regions where diverse communities have long coexisted and interacted with each other. The concept of transculturality considers the intermixing of cultures as a historically continuous phenomenon, and thus serves to examine transnational processes that have been neglected by national historiography and an ethnocentric art history. With respect to the study of Gandharan art, this means having to foreground the history of cultural interaction in the greater Gandhara region and to conceptualize its cultural objects as more interdependent than the various academic specializations have been willing to perceive up to this point. Following, I'm going to apply the concept of transculturality to existing scholarship on Gandhara in order to examine the manner in which its authors perceived of and accounted for transcultural relationships and movements, and how this affected the formulation and construction of their research object. Gandhara has been studied according to the disciplines of archaeology, Buddhology, Indology, Sinology, classical arts, as well as related disciplines. After earlier studies had been divided over the question as to whether contact had occurred at all between Greek and Indian cultures, the issue became revived in the early 20th century. In 1918, French archaeologist Alfred Fouché described contact between Greek and Indian cultures as having taken place as the result of Hellenistic imperialism. In Fouché's opinion, artistic production and exchange in the Gandhara region were a corollary to the military conquest and destruction, by which he meant that emergent art processes had followed the distribution of power. While Fouché acknowledged the intrusion of Greek culture on the Indian subcontinent, he viewed the adaptation of disparate sculptural styles as the wholesale borrowing of Greek elements by Indian artisans. However, he simultaneously defended this process of borrowing as a unique merging of Western and Eastern civilizations. In 1954, British scholar Alexander Soper described the intermingling of cultures in the Gandhara region as the product of historical upheaval and transformation that was simultaneously stimulated by trade and economic exchange. Soper explained that ethnic intermixing, which had caused what he termed the racial confusion of the age, had a bearing on works of art and their making, by which he meant that processes of artistic cross-fertilization were influenced as much by political constellations as by increasingly peaceful contact and mutual interest. The viewpoints of early Western scholarship were opposed by a number of Indian scholars who, citing the overrating of Western influence, rejected a definition of India and Asia through Western culture. These scholars argued that neither chronologies nor art forms blended in the way it had been suggested by these Western specialists. Furthermore, they rejected the impact of military conquest on India and instead explained transcultural encounter as the quick absorption of Greek culture into the Indian cultural sphere, where the Greek culture was ultimately and effectively annihilated. In a similar vein, art historian and philosopher Ananda Coomaraswamy in 1928 rejected European attempts at discursively constructing a connection between Eastern and Western traditions when, according to him, no such influences could be conclusively established. Late 20th and early 21st century Western scholarship on Gandhara has tended to soften the dialectical constellation of the East-West axis of political and military power relations. Instead, the emphasis has moved to examining the complex layers and dynamics of local cultural trends. These scholars have emphasized the strong multicultural and highly skilled nature of intermingling in the Gandhara region and have variously described Gandhara as a place between four worlds, as being multi-ethnic and international, multicultural and early global, as well as highly significant and creative. In 1994, art historian Stanley Abe offered a post-colonial critique of the core assumptions that have evolved over 150 years of scholarship on Gandhara and its art. Abe criticizes Western art historians for seeking to incorporate Buddhist art into Western knowledge while striving to maintain the otherness of Buddhist art, which, however, through the art historical act of possession and control, has simultaneously been erased. For example, as to the question of transcultural encounter, Abe states that the, quote, imaginary space of Western scholarship is the only place where different cultures can interact on seemingly equal terms. Abe calls the assumptions of Western scholarship that preconfigure the object of research a, quote, privileged ground for understanding between cultures, a universalist ideal that is firmly grounded in the liberal tradition of the West, meaning that Gandhara was essentially a discursive procedure that was realized as archaeological evidence. Abe concludes that the scholarly efforts by Western researchers have been propelled by the intersection of culture and race and the tangled relationship between scholarship and international politics. Preliminary results. When considering Gandhara through a transcultural lens, it has to be noted that the various contacts and exchanges between ancient Mediterranean and Western Asian cultures have long been described not only in the specialized literature of the past 150 years, but also since the 5th century BC up to the 6th century or even 7th century AD by Greek and Roman historians, as well as Indian, Chinese, and Korean pilgrims and monks. This means that transcultural encounter and exchange as a historical phenomenon is not new, and that the intermixing of cultures cannot be exclusively ascribed to postmodern or contemporary global conditions. A transcultural approach to the study of Gandhara would thus have to give more prominence to the complex civilizational contacts between Greece, Rome, Persia, India, as well as various nomadic peoples in the greater Gandhara region. In this context, a transcultural approach would also be able to identify the underlying national biases and disciplinary agendas which inform the research on Gandhara and which have ultimately caused the construction of Gandharan art as a predominantly regional phenomenon. In the end, a transcultural approach would also serve to reveal contemporary practices of framing Gandhara in a transnational and transcultural context. Following this, the binary construction of Gandhara as a peaceful and flourishing Buddhist paradise whose fate was sealed by the destructive forces of Muslim ideology, as happened in one of the essays of this exhibition catalog, would be viewed as reductive since it simultaneously de-emphasizes two colonial movements, the first by Alexander the Great and the second by the British Empire, and their respective damaging impact at different historical moments. As for the latter, one might cite, among others, the flawed excavation practices that have rendered the identification of the majority of artifacts impossible. As Stanley Abe points out, it was these excavation practices, as well as related dynamics, that facilitated, quote, the transforming of loot from the colonized world into educational exhibits in the Western Hemisphere. Unquote. As we have seen, the study of Gandhara in its art is a complex and politically charged endeavor. I have engaged the concept of transculturality in order to raise the question of Gandharan art in the context of global art history. However, Stanley Abe is against the concept of transculturality since, according to him, it would incorporate Gandhara into a, quote, universal history in which East-West exchange was symmetrical and mutually beneficial. Interpictoriality. Having developed a transcultural approach, having developed a transcultural framework with respect to the study of Gandhara in the previous section, I'm now going to apply a similar framework to the study of its artifacts, namely that of interpictoriality. Interpictoriality, instead of aiming to identify disparate artistic styles and differing national origins, that is, a fragmenting interpretation of artwork, privileges trans or interpictorial processes highlighting interaction, co-creation, and synthesis. Based on the concept of interpictoriality, I will be able to consider impulses for contact and relationship, as well as cultural objects as taking form in the tension between different cultural knowledges. The inquiry into the nature of artistic contact and interaction between Greek and Indian craftsmen is closely related to the question of the role of Buddhism in the rise of Gandharan art, and especially the evolution of the Buddha image. Early Buddhism was largely aniconic due to the historical Buddha's demand that his likeness not be depicted, and due to the Vedic conception of spiritual masters as having no form, for which reason worship of the Buddha occurred in the form of symbols, such as the Bodhi tree and the Buddha's footprint. In the context of Gandharan art, the key issue has thus been whether early representations of the Buddha evolved out of Indian traditions or whether they derived from Greek mythological influences, that is, the depiction of male gods. For example, Alfred Fauché, the French archaeologist, described the Gandharan Buddha image as bearing an essentially classical Greek imprint, by which he articulated his perception of Greece as the stronger, more influential culture, and India as the weaker culture. Against this perception, Ananda Kumaraswamy argued in 1928 that the Indian Yaksha image had served as a prototype for the later Buddha image, and that, generally speaking, elements of Buddhist anthropomorphic iconography had already been present in early Indian art. Alexander Soper, in 1951, shifted the focus of debate from freestanding Buddha images to narrative friezes. Soper observed that while seated Buddha statues reflect an Indian perception of anthropomorphic dimensions, the standing images follow a different aesthetic ideal whose fluid movements in a three-quarter pose resembles most closely that of a Roman dignitary or ruler. In contrast to Early scholarship on Gandharan sculpture, Benjamin Rowland in 1949 and 1967 emphasized the complex syncretic character of Gandharan Buddhist statuary as a mixture of Hellenistic tradition with Indian or Iranian elements. He called attention to the interplay of minor deities, sovereigns, and tutelary figures derived from Roman, Iranian, and Indian mythology and military history on Kushan coins in conjunction with the emergent Buddha type. Carol Woodford Schmidt in 2009 argued that the top knot prevalent in bodhisattva images found at Zari-Balol would derive from the so-called knot of Heracles hairstyle known from images of Apollo. According to Woodford Schmidt, the adaptation of the Greek chignon in Gandhara was due to its superior functionality for binding hair, but it may also have been in part the result of aesthetic considerations. Returning to the question of the origin of the Buddha image, Elizabeth Errington, after several decades of research on the matter, suggests in 1994 that the anthropomorphic form of the Buddha simultaneously emerged in the greater Gandhara region. Preliminary results. As the above discussion has demonstrated, the concept of interpictoriality as a category of analysis reveals the limited explanatory power and reach of static models when considering what appears to be an essentially transcultural phenomenon, namely the evolution of the Gandharan Buddha image. Thus, instead of focusing on the question of the origin of the Buddha image, an interpictorial approach would shift the focus on the movement and translation of motives and meanings, that is, the delimitation of pictorial orders and the articulation of change. With regard to artistic interaction in Gandhara, one may therefore deduce that it operated on a multi-directional process, which, if we follow Elizabeth Errington, was marked by simultaneity, for which reason it cannot be forced into a Western chronological frame. Furthermore, the Gandharan visual field points to multi-layered reflective and identificatory processes that cannot be explained in terms of a linear art historical model of stylistic cause and effect, but which rather should be perceived as a moment of interdependent arising and mutual interlinking. These processes of contact and emergence express themselves in the doubled nature of the gaze, which, while progressing in a reflective visual network, expands the art object as well as the act of seeing. Gender in a transcultural context. Gender as a category of analysis has not yet been considered in the study of Gandharan art, even though the cultural objects themselves depict a wide range of male, female, and ambiguous gender constructions, raising the questions of the role and dynamics of gender in a transcultural context. A transcultural approach to gender in Gandharan art would ask, among other things, whether the interpenetration of different cultures also caused the interpenetration of different gender orders. British classicist Sir John Boardman asserts that the nude form did not play a significant role in Gandharan plastic arts. Individual studies of figures shown in various states of dress and undress point, however, to a sustained and even pronounced interest in the naked and gendered body. For example, this image shows Atlantis wearing a loincloth, whereas the following image shows him with a cape, just covering his left shoulder and dipping down into a sweep below his front side. The third image shows him with only the ends of his cape tied into an elaborate knot across his chest. Might this be taken as a gesture of ancient show and tell? If so, one may surmise that nudity and dress fulfilled a specific function in the negotiation of cultural and physical differences. The display of nudity in secondary figures may also have served as a framing device for the typically regally dressed Buddha, as can be observed in this frieze, which we have already seen earlier, where the Buddha's cloaked figure, to the left, is contrasted with the exposed backside of a male figure. Regarding the display of female figures, One first of all notes that there is a wide range of images depicting goddesses and female mythical beings that aren't conventionally included in the discussion of Gandharan art. Furthermore, little scholarly effort has been spent studying the interactive pictorial relationships between Indian, Iranian, Greek, and Roman female icons, not to mention their respective sexual symbolisms. Just as their male counterparts, these images of females indicate multi-layered processes of interplay and adaptation. However, their scale and meanings have remained largely hidden over the past 150 years. In addition to processes of demarcation, as in the case of the clothed and unclothed figures, and processes of convergence, as in the case of female icons, one can also observe processes of divergence that speak to the relevance of gender in the Gandharan visual field. By this I mean the progressive articulation of body types in bodhisattva images from a masculine appearance to a more fluid and gender-ambiguous form. This aesthetic decision might have been guided by a cultural preference for untextured skin over toned muscles, indicating perhaps a resistance to Greek representations of masculinity, as well as a preference for ambiguous or female-connoted gender markers in accordance with the bodhisattva's role within the Buddhist pantheon. One may preliminarily conclude that the encounter of different cultures also entailed the encounter of different gender orders, where, broadly speaking, early processes of iconization in Buddhist art intersected with iconographic conventions from other cultural spheres. With respect to the depiction of gender in antiquity, this means that we observe a general instability of binary gender constructions, East or West, as well as the transient nature of aesthetic and gendered elements that are adrift between fundamentally different sculptural traditions. These preliminary findings also suggest the singular importance of the plastic arts as a medium for ancient transcultural encounter and exchange, that is, sculpture as the privileged side of the negotiation and communication of core knowledges about the gendered human form. Conclusion. My paper attempted to demonstrate how academic research on Gandhara is situated on complex disciplinary, geographical, and temporal fault lines, the reciprocal dynamics of which have had a deep and long-lasting effect on the production of knowledge about the early global high culture of Gandhara. I delineated how Gandhara has been articulated as a topic of research over the past 150 years, namely through the lens of archaeology, Buddhology, Indology, Sinology, classical art, and numismatics, as well as other related disciplines. I also delineated how Gandhara could or should be re-examined in the future so as to recenter central paradigms and methodologies and to shape arguments about the relevance of Gandharan art in a broader art historical global context. I propose that the consideration of Gandhara would raise the question of the appreciation of non-classical arts and culture in antiquity. This change of perspective would de-emphasize European exceptionalism and open the view for the achievements of more distant cultures, in this case, the relations of different civilizations and their cultural and artistic interactions. Such an approach would also join the art histories of European and Asian traditions together and put the focus on the geographical space where these trajectories were active, namely the Eurasian landmass as a key zone for civilizational exchange and cultural metamorphosis. However, as a result of the lack of transcultural and global approaches from the field of Gandhara studies, the power of defining global art historical phenomena has been left to the already implicated disciplines in global art historical studies and their institutional affiliations. For example, of the 3 academic programs that have recently been established at German universities, the Global Art History Program at Heidelberg University, the research group Transcultural Spaces of Negotiation of Art at Free University of Berlin, as well as the government-funded initiative Crossroads Asia at Bonn University, none appears to consider the transcultural and interartistic exchange of the greater Gandhara region. Thus, even though a transcultural and global approach to Gandharan art in theory has the potential to generate much interest at the national and international levels, it may well remain unclaimed by any discipline or academic program. Thank you.